Hello. Yes. Okay. So, um, I wanted to take a look at this labor leisure diagram, in which we have leisure on the x-axis, and we actually have income on the y-axis. So, this is particularly important because this tends to be a very fundamental idea for policymakers in terms of how to really assess the consumption of labor or the consumption of leisure, depending on how you want to look at it. They're sort of inverses of each other. So essentially, if we're all well endowed with 24 hours, right? That's painfully apparent because we start over here, right? Now, if we're on that with 24 leisure hours, it's our job to decide how to spend those hours, whether working or doing something else. So, if we'd like to spend all 24 hours working, we would essentially be over here, which would imply that we have a wage of $1 for this wage constraint, right? And if we spend all hours working and we make 48, right, that would imply $2 wages, and then 72 would imply $3 wages. Right now, our wages go up consistently given essentially as you move up the wage constraints, right? So keep that in mind. Our optimal bundle at a wage of $1 is to consume 18 hours of leisure, right? So from here we could compose our demand for leisure. So this is demand for leisure at a wage of $1. We essentially consume 18 hours. So hours of leisure. So we consume 18 hours. 18 is way out here. And then at $2, we consume 15 hours of leisure. So at $2, we consume 15 hours of leisure. And then at $3, we consume about 12 hours of leisure. Right? So we have a downward sloping demand for leisure, right? That makes sense because as you work in this context, depending on what type of good leisure is, as you essentially move up the ranks, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but we oftentimes choose to spend less time on working, right? I'm sorry. We choose to work more, right? Because if our wages go up, right, our leisure hours go down, right? So we may spend more time working if we make more because the opportunity cost of leisure becomes very high, right? The higher your wages go, right? So, um, okay, so essentially from here we could also derive the labor, supply of labor, $1, $2, 3 hours. Okay, so we got hours of work. Okay, so if at $1 we're willing to supply, I'm sorry, we're willing to take 18 hours of leisure, that would assume that we're willing to supply. That would imply that we're going to give 6 hours of work. So here we're at six. So we're at six, and then if at a wage of two, if we demand 15 hours of leisure, that assumes we're willing to that implies we're willing to give 9 hours of work, right? So 9 hours of work. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. And then we have, if we consume 12 hours of leisure, then we work 12 hours as well because we have 24 hours, right? So, all right, we have an upward sloping supply of labor and a downward sloping demand for leisure, right? And essentially, this would be ideal in this context. Now, let's assume that our our graph looked like this. So um, we have okay here, and then this is everything else remains constant with in terms of the intercepts. But now let's assume that our optimal consumption of hold on, sorry. our optimal consumption of leisure is higher. So let's assume we're at this bundle, right? For that wage constraint. If we're at that bundle, right, then that means our supply of labor would change, right? So, okay, so if we're at 18 hours of leisure, then we supply 6 hours of work, right? If we are at 15 hours of leisure, then we would supply 9 hours of work. So this stays the same, but, right, at a wage of 3, right, we're now consuming more leisure, right? So if we're consuming more leisure, 17 hours of leisure, that means we have less time for work. So essentially, we would be supplying less hours of work, right? So now we would just be supplying 7 hours of work. So it goes like this. So this is essentially what I'm trying to say is we have a backward bending labor supply curve because leisure became more attractive. We're willing to exchange some of our work hours that we were working before for more leisure, depending on consumer preferences, because we make more. This sort of go. I'll give you an analogy. So if you have LeBron James, right? Was he make millions, way more than I do? Essentially, if he makes about 100,000 more dollars, that's not going to cause a significant spike in how much he's willing to work. In fact, he may be willing to cut back on working and actually decide to consume more leisure, right? He may decide to move from about here to about, say, down here and have a backward bending labor supply curve. That's essentially where it comes from, right? So essentially, he's willing to substitute the substitution effect. Some of his, he's willing to substitute leisure in place of the work, the hours he was working because he makes more, right? So that would be an example of a backward bending labor supply curve. And essentially, if we want to look at the income substitution effects, right? Let's just do an example over here, right? So we have income substitution. So we're still endowed with 24 hours, right? 48, 24, let's just do an example, right? And let's just say for over here, right? Okay, so if this is our old bundle, right? The wages have increased from about $1 to $2, right? So this is our old bundle, and this is our new bundle, right? If we superimpose this wage constraint onto this indifference curve, right, it intersects at about right here, right? Let's call this point B, right? So the substitution effect would behoove the consumer to essentially consume less leisure and work more hours. So we're going consuming less leisure, working more because we're going slightly up. So this is a substitution effect, right? And the income effect would behoove the consumer to move from point B to point D. So the income effect essentially completely reverses the substitution effect. So essentially the total effect would be from A to D, right? So the total effect would be from A to D, right? So now what does this mean? So if our wage effectively went up, right? So in our real income went up. Our real income went up, right? If our real income went up and we're willing to essentially move our consumption of this amount of leisure to more amount of leisure, right? Then that implies a direct relationship between income and consumption of leisure, right? So if we consume more leisure, giving a $1 increase in income, then that would make leisure a normal good. Okay, that would just be an example of everything. Okay, so